Good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us to our fourth RCPath Book Club. I've heard from the engagement team, Tadja and Penny, that we've got close to 380 people registered in the audience. That's amazing. I'm really, really pleased. So my name is Sarah Coupland. I'm a consultant histopathologist. That is, I'm a microscope doctor, I tell to my children, working at the Liverpool Clinical Laboratories at the Royal Liverpool University Hospital in Liverpool in the UK. I'm also the Vice President for Communications at the Royal College of Pathologists. Tonight we'll be featuring the non-fiction book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which was written by Rebecca Skloot in 2010. It has won a number of awards, including the 2011 National Academy's Communication Award for Best Creative Work that helps the public understanding of topics in science, engineering, or medicine. This paperback edition spent 75 weeks, i.e. 1.5 years, on the New York Times bestseller list. The book is about a woman, Henrietta Lacks, and the development of the world's first immortal human cancer cell line, known as HeLa. And that came from Henrietta's cervical cancer cells in 1951. So who was Henrietta? She was born to a poor black tobacco farmer in 1920. She grew up in a small place called Clover in Virginia, where her ancestors had been slaves. And she then moved later to Turner Station in Baltimore County, where her husband called with her husband called Day. And together they had 5 children, with the eldest being Deborah and the youngest being Joe. And both of these feature quite prominently within the book, particularly Deborah. Unfortunately, in 1951, Henrietta developed cervical cancer, and a tumor sample was taken during the surgical procedure without her knowledge and without her consent. She died quite rapidly at the age of 31. The title of the book, The Immortality, refers to the HeLa cells, which were derived from this tissue biopsy. And it was distributed in unimaginable numbers to labs across the globe, and which ultimately paved the way for great scientific achievements, which we'll go into. The patient behind the HeLa cells, however, remains secret, to be revealed only 25 years after Henrietta's death, both to the scientific community and also to her family. So it's appropriate that we're reviewing this book this month, as we had last week Cervical Screening Awareness Week. And it is particularly appropriate also that over the weekend in the US, there was Juneteenth, which was the celebration of the abolition of slavery in 1865. So Henrietta's story raises several issues, which we'll discuss tonight, including scientific ethics and informed consent, health informatics, and the existence of racism within some of the members of the medical and scientific community, lack of communication between medics and their patients and the public, cycles of poverty and abuse, and the importance of women's health. And many of these themes, symbols, and motifs came through in the HBO film production, which starred Oprah Winfrey. So we really could have 2 or 3 nights going through this book, but unfortunately we've only got one night, we've got limited time, but we're absolutely honored and delighted to have on the panel here both Jeri Lacks and David Lacks. So Jeri and David are the grandchildren of Henrietta Lacks and the children of Henrietta's middle son, Sonny Lacks. So Jeri works at the Judiciary System of Baltimore and the Domestic Violence Unit. She has visited dozens of campuses and communities across the states, sharing her perspective on the legacy of Henrietta and the HeLa cells. She keeps her grandmother's legacy alive while using her family story as a platform to address national issues, including preventative healthcare, health disparities, literacy, and also community trust. David Jr. has a degree in computer information systems, has traveled around North America setting up computer systems and labs for companies and schools. He's assisted in the creation of the Lacks family website and maintains the Lacks family digital media. He organized to celebrate Henrietta's 100th birthday last year. And this was undertaken virtually as a result of the pandemic, but despite this was a great success. Both of them also co-founded the so-called I Celebrate, Henrietta Lacks, and both are also involved on the panel of the National Institute of Health, where they oversee any research applications investigating the HeLa cells. So we're also joined, have the great honor to be joined by Professor Mark Wilkinson, who is a retired pathologist, Dr Hephzi Tagoe, who is a scientist and scientific communicator, and Dr Esther Youd, who's a pathologist. But I will ask them each to briefly introduce themselves, and before we kick off with a short reading of the book from Jeri. So Mark, Esther, and Hephzi, would you like just to briefly say hello?
As well as being a histopathologist, I've had a long involvement in research ethics, both in the NHS and university sector. And towards the very end of my career, I was the director of a biorepository in Norwich.
Thank you. Hephzi?
I'm an autopsy pathologist based up in Glasgow, but I'm also the Royal College of Pathologists Assistant Registrar. And for the last year, I've been heading up work at the Royal College on diversity and inclusion.
And I'm a skin biologist with specialty in dermatology, and I actively work as a science communicator at the moment and also in education with young people.
Thank you very much and welcome. Okay, so a bit of housekeeping before we start, sorry. This event is being recorded, you might have noticed that already, and will be made available on the RCPath YouTube channel. The audience is invited to tweet about the event using the Twitter handle at RCPath and also hashtag RCPath Book Club. And all of our attendees are invited to write questions to Jeri, David, or the panelists using the Q&A area of the Zoom webinar. And a selection of these will be gone through after the panel discussion. So Jeri, I had the great pleasure of meeting you, your husband Tom, and David Jr. in 2019 when you came here to Liverpool, and you visited the Cancer Research Centre that we had here, and also you visited an installation at the gallery, the Tate Gallery in Liverpool. We reached out to you via the Dax Foundation website, and we were just overwhelmed and so happy when you replied in the positive that you were happy to come and visit us. But could you please tell us a bit about the Dax Foundation and what it does?
Okay, the Lacks Foundation was started by Rebecca Sklood. She had promised my aunt Deborah Lacks, who actually went on a journey with Rebecca to write the book, that if the book became successful, that she wanted to start this foundation, the Henrietta Lacks Foundation. And the Henrietta Lacks Foundation is a foundation just try to helping individuals who have contributed to science and has not properly been benefited from the contributions. So it was a way of her trying to help other individuals, but particularly education, because my aunt Deborah knew that it was expensive to, try to go beyond high school and go to college and how expensive it was. And she wanted to make sure that her family members were able to attend college and successfully to pursue their degree.
Right, well, that's great. That's terrific. So, well, if you don't mind, if we can move on to the reading that you've chosen. So it's from chapter 10, for those who may have the book with them, and it's on page 93 of this version of the book. I know that the page numbers vary between the books. So Jeri, if you wouldn't mind reading that passage.
Okay, so I'm starting, let me see. Okay, Cootie opened a folding chair for me. When walked into his bedroom, he lifted his mattress with one arm, propped it up on his head, and began rummaging through piles of paper hidden beneath it. I know I got some information on Henrietta in here somewhere, he mumbled from under the mattress. Where the hell I put that? You know, other countries be buying her $25, sometimes $50. Our family didn't get no money out of it. After digging through what looked like hundreds of papers, he came back to the living room. This here, the only picture I got of her, he said, pointing to a copy of the Rolling Stone article with the ever-present hands on hips photo. I don't know what it say. Only education I got. I had to learn on my own, but I always couldn't count, and I couldn't hardly read or write my name because my hands jittered. He asked if the article said anything about her childhood in Clover. I shook my head no. Everybody liked Henrietta because she was a very good conditioned person, he said. She just lovey-dovey, always smiling, always taking care of us when we come to her house. After she got sick, she never was a person who would say, I feel bad and I'm going to take it out on you. She was like that, even when she was hurting. But she didn't seem to understand what was going on. She didn't want to think she was going to die. He shook his head. You know, they say if we could all get the pieces of her together, she'll weigh over 800 pounds now, he told me. And Henrietta was never a big girl. She was still growing. In the background, the radio preacher screamed, hallelujah, over and over as Cootie spoke. She used to take care of me when my polio got bad, he told me. She always did say she wanted to fix it. She couldn't help me because I had it before she got sick, but she saw how bad it got. I imagine that's why she used them cells to get help, to get rid of it for other folks. He paused. Nobody around here never understood how she died. And that thing still living. That's where the mystery is.
Thank you very much, Jeri. That's lovely. Very powerful passage in the book, particularly as Cootie himself suffered from polio. And it's a bit ironic that Henrietta's cells ultimately helped generate the vaccine against polio. So can I just ask both you and David, when did you two find out about Henrietta's story, and how? Was it via the book, or was it via your relatives? Don't know who would like to answer that question.
Oh, okay, well, I thought David. Okay, I don't know. My age, I think I may have been in high school when I found out about my grandmother's story, but it was like the basic information that she had polio. That she helped with polio. She died from cancer. I didn't know what type of cancer she died from. Her cells went up into space. And always articles out there, probably like 1970s. I think it was Rolling Stones or but it was articles out there. But we just wasn't, or I wasn't, Henrietta's grandchildren wasn't, really familiar with her story and how deep it was. We didn't really know Henrietta as a person because nobody ever spoke of her. And I guess, back then, if you're dead, you're dead. You don't speak of the dead. So I got my majority of my information I got from the book, and then other family members started opening up. When I was reading the book, I was like, wow, I can visualize her, who she was as a mother, as a daughter, as a wife. Just reading over, it just gave a description, like she never went out the house with a neatly pleated skirt, and she always loved to dance. She loved cooking. She had hazel eyes. It's just like deep descriptions of her. So now I don't have to look at the pictures like, oh, wow, she's pretty. Now I can kind of visualize, oh, yeah, this was a gorgeous woman, and know how she took care of her family, and not only just her family, friends as well, because they always said, she was a helping person. She had hospitality. So, I just, I love the book, and I love what it gave me as a granddaughter of Henrietta Lacks, because our dad died. Our mother died when he was 4 years old. So he really couldn't tell us much about his mother. So it was like a generational thing where, one family member doesn't know and the next family member doesn't know. So now the grandchildren know. So now we can pass it along to our children so they can continuously tell our grandmother's story.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. That's really great. So David, can I ask you a question? Obviously,
Sure.
you know that Henrietta's cells have significantly advanced science, and they've aided to the development of the vaccine, the polio vaccine we just mentioned, and they've helped also the development of the COVID vaccine during the latest pandemic. They've also enabled the mapping of the human genome. So when you were here with us, we went into our laboratory and we looked under the microscope together. But I was just wondering, when was the first time you two perhaps looked at the HeLa cells, and how did you feel when you perhaps saw them under the microscope?
The first time I seen the HeLa cells, I guess, I believe it was at Johns Hopkins. They do what they call a microscope day there.
Okay.
And they're bringing people in from out the community, and of course the Lacks family. So they brought us and you know, they let the family look under the microscope, and we got to see the HeLa cells. And I thought they was quite amazing. I mean, because the colors was beautiful, but the fact of seeing like something that was connected to my grandmother still living,
yeah,
it was quite amazing. Quite, you know, like wow.
Yeah.
And my I always tell a story about how my father said he said they put one cell sample in a petri dish of HeLa cells, and they watched how the HeLa cells took over the other cells and became HeLa cells. And he always say, my mother must have been a bad woman in life, because in death, she don't want nobody in her petri dish. So, so he always like comment about that, like the first time he seen him. And he was in awe too, in awe as well. I think, you know, all the family members was just in awe and seeing them, just like, you know, these actually came from our grandmother.
Yeah, yeah, no, terrific. So can I ask, what's your opinion about the use of other human cell lines and perhaps human tissue in research?
I guess as far as like, as long as they had consent, because we need like scientists, we need medicine, we need scientists, we need the advancements that come from that. So the use of human cells or cells in general is a needed necessity. But I would say, you know, just get consent and let the family or the origins of the cell first know. Because one of the biggest things I think is not that they took the cell, or that they used the cells, and so many developments came about it. It's that the family never knew about it.
Yeah.
And then in 1951, they extracted the cells, and like a week later, you knew them cells were special, but you never sought to tell the family about it. And I think that was like the, you know, most hurtful part of it.
I just wanted to add on about, you know, when you had asked about the family going to see the cells for the very first time, it was amazing because, like David said, it was considered the microscope day for the family members, family and friends. And it was amazing because it was, you know, the family members actually going for the very first time seeing these cells together as a family. So I think that was, you know, a powerful statement, powerful move for our family to get, you know, get each other's opinion and how we felt about seeing the cells. And like David said, you know, it's just so amazing just to see our grandmother's cells and how they dance around, and how Henrietta's cells took over another cell line. And it was just, you know, pretty amazing. And just, it was amazing looking at the cells under different microscopes and how much these microscopes cost. So it was a learning lesson for the entire family, you know, with the grandkids, the great grandkids, and Henrietta's children.
Terrific, thank you. So Hephzi, you're a research scientist with a PhD in skin biology, as you mentioned. Can I just ask how you felt about reading Henrietta's story? Did it change your mind in any way about the use of cell lines or of human tissue?
I'm saying yes and no based on when I read the book. So the first time I read the book, I was a postgraduate student. I wasn't quite a PhD yet. So although I was still working in the lab, it was more jaw-dropping moments. Your early 20s, and you're sort of thinking, oh my gosh, did that really happen? And will that happen today? And an eye-opener the first time around when I'd read it. But then post-PhD now, reading it the second time, it then raises a lot of questions. And more importantly, I think what it did for me is to perhaps put a bit more what I call respect on the cell lines that we work with in the labs, because you don't realize, I suppose, the processes, not also, but particularly in the case of HeLa cells, the history and the personal connections around cells that you may find in the lab that you're working with. And when it comes to tissue culture, obviously cells can grow rapidly and you're changing medium regularly, and you subconsciously were doing something routinely all the time without realizing actually these cell lines have come from a respectable source, or a source where you should perhaps treat it a bit more love and care when you're in the lab and working with them. So I think that's what it did for me more second time around, I suppose the first time around, where it was more a case of, oh my gosh, wow, that's really fascinating. Whereas now you sort of think twice about what you have in your hands that you should take more care of.
Right. Oh, that's great. Yes. Thank you. So I'm just going to read another quote from the book. So it's page 19. And it was when Henrietta went to Johns Hopkins University Hospital for the first time. And it says, I'll just read it. It said, for Henrietta, walking into Hopkins was like entering a foreign country where she didn't speak the language. She knew about harvesting tobacco and butchering a pig, but she'd never heard the words cervix or biopsy. She didn't read much or write much, and she hadn't studied science in school. She, like most Black patients, only went to Hopkins when she thought she had no choice. So Hephzi, you're very much involved in science communication with the younger generation, particularly in BAME communities. What does this book tell us about how we should be communicating science to these communities, for example, about education in cervical cancer screening and also informed consent?
I'd say quite a lot, actually, because it takes us back to pre-assumptions, which we all can quite easily fall into. And specifically when it comes to science communication with the target audience that we tend to work with the most, in as much as we're working with the younger people, we tend to involve the parents as well, because they're quite involved in key decisions that the children are having to make. And so we found out quite earlier on that just engaging kids in perhaps career choices or the amazing world of research on its own was not enough, because then you get a disjointed scenarios where kids are saying one thing and the parents are saying something different. So I think it's quite key when working with those communities to take a holistic community approach as opposed to just the target audience that you may ultimately want to be reaching. And so that's one thing that I would pick from there. And in communicating, to not just use the language for the young people and the children, but ones that their parents can relate and connect with as well. Yeah,
that's great. Thank you. So Mark, sorry, I'll just move on to you. So in the book, it highlights several historical unethical studies. So in chapter 17, we find out about a well-respected cancer researcher and chief of virology at the Sloan Kettering Institute for Cancer Research, called Chester Southern. So Southern conducted highly unethical experiments beginning in 1954, so only 3 years after Henrietta's death, and where he injected HeLa cells into cancer patients and then later into healthy prisoners under false pretenses to test essentially to see if they'd become infected, inverted commas, by the HeLa cells and develop cancer. So obviously Southern's study was described as illegal, immoral and deplorable and compared to Nazi research. There are other significant examples mentioned in the book, such as the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in African-American males, which ran for 40 years. Could you tell us briefly about this study for anyone who's not familiar with it? Yeah,
the Tuskegee study started in 1932, and they were seeking to observe the outcome of syphilis. They had 600 Afro-American men in total, 399 had syphilis, 201 were controls. And at the outset, they apparently told the men they were studying bad blood, which was a term used to describe syphilis amongst other diseases. And interestingly, in the book is actually the catching of STD, is referred to using exactly that term in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And the men got something in exchange for taking part in the studies. They got something they were told as treatment, which was probably either ineffective or a placebo. They got free medical exams, free meals, and slightly interesting, they got burial insurance. But in 1943, it was clear that syphilis could be effectively treated quite cheaply with penicillin. And the researchers chose not to give that to the participants. They just carried on watching them until, in fact, 1972, when the study was forcibly closed down. Even in 1972, it was an external closure. And in fact, in 1997, President Clinton issued a formal presidential apology for the study. So I guess, whilst it might not stand critical appraisal by modern standards, at the time it started, the study probably wasn't too bad. The big ethical failure came in 1943 when they chose not to use penicillin.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. So there's a paragraph in the book, this was changing slight tack. There's a paragraph in the book on page 105 where it's describing Henrietta's red toenails. And I think this is a sort of very powerful symbol in the book. And when they were observed by Mary Kubitschek, who was Dr. George Guy's assistant during Henrietta's autopsy, which was when actually Mary was collecting further tissue from the secondary tumors that had spread. And ironically, to harvest these tissues, they did have to obtain consent for the autopsy from Day. So there's this paragraph that says, then Mary's gaze fell on Henrietta's feet. And she gasped. Henrietta's toenails were covered in chipped, bright red polish. When I saw those toenails, Mary told me years later, I nearly fainted. I thought, oh geez, she's a real person. I started imagining her sitting in the bathroom, painting those nails. And it hit me for the first time that those cells we'd been working with all these time and sending all across the world, they came from a live woman. I'd never thought of it that way. So it was only then that Mary Kay realized that she and Dr. Gay had essentially dehumanized Henrietta and turned her into cells only. This dehumanization was also apparent actually throughout the fact that Dr. Guy refused to release Henrietta's name, calling her Helen Lane when he was interviewed by journalists. So her true name was only revealed without approaching the family first, after Dr. Guy's death, in a newspaper article. So, Mark, how have medical ethics around consent in human tissue improved since the 1950s? What laws are in place now to prevent similar mistakes or practices being made?
There is a degree of international standardization of research ethics. Started in Nuremberg in 1947, but it's now called the Declaration of Helsinki, and we're working on the 2013 revision. And most countries sign up to it. And in that, it's very clear that the principles of fully informed consent apply equally to research on human tissues as on any other research on humans. Goes into more detail on human tissues where it specifies it's only working on identifiable tissue. So it leaves this problem of unidentifiable tissue, which perhaps should be addressed in the next revision. The problem is that the Declaration of Helsinki has not been adopted into law in any country as far as I'm aware. So legal penalties are restricted to very few examples, the UK Human Tissue Act being such an example. There are other issues. So within the Declaration of Helsinki, there is a major requirement for independent approval of the ethics of a committee by a research ethics committee and independent oversight by an ethics committee. In the British NHS, research ethics committees are independent, but in most other situations, both the approval committee and in all situations, the oversight committee are set up by the people who host the research. And throughout the book, from fairly early on, right the way through to the afterword, we realize that scientists aren't very good at buying into this idea. I think it's quite telling, as said in the book, that Chester Southern was actually elected president of the American Association of Cancer Researchers 10, 12 years after he'd been pilloried in the press for his unethical research.
Yeah.
And the thing that worries me in some ways most is that is the Baltimore lead paint study, which started in 1993. So 40 years after Tuskegee made its major ethical failing. And they made exactly the same failing. So they identified toxic levels of lead in the blood of young children and chose to neither do anything about it themselves, nor tell the parents of the children that there was a problem. And those children will, of course, carry the side effects of that lead poisoning to the day they die. And in 2001, the Johns Hopkins vigorously defended their researchers, both in the courts and in the medical literature. So I think we really need to look at what we think about Helsinki and find a way of getting major institutions to buy into it before we can really say we've resolved or addressed the problems properly.
Thank you very much, Mark. It was very, very informative and very interesting. And hopefully we can make progress through the revised Helsinki. So Esther, a major theme in the book is racial health inequalities. And that's something that's still present very much in the UK and most likely also in the US. You've championed the Diversity, Inclusion and Equality Committee in the college. I'd just like to read another passage. Sorry, I've just got to find it. My little marks are falling out. So it's touching again on the Tuskegee syphilis trial. So Black scientists and technicians, many of them women, use cells from a Black woman, to help save the lives of millions of Americans, most of them white. And they did so on the same campus and at the same time that state officials were conducting the infamous Tuskegee syphilis studies. So how do you think that we, as doctors and others as scientists and policymakers, can help improve equity in healthcare across all groups in society?
Well, I think first of all, we have to recognise that there's a problem and recognise that it is racism that underpins that. And that can be very difficult to accept as a white person living in a white society. But it is the case, when the colour of your skin defines where you live, what education you have, what access to healthcare you have, what your opportunities might be, then it does define a lot about your life. In the UK, so we can't just deny that this is a problem in the UK, just think that racism is a problem in the US. Clearly there is a problem here too. One of the areas of work that I get involved with is reviewing maternal deaths. And in women who are pregnant, Black women are 4 times more likely to die during or shortly after pregnancy than white women, and Asian women 3 times more likely to die. And there's lots of complicated reasons for that, but part of it is to do with the fact that Black people are treated differently than white people. And we have to realise that and accept it, and therefore be able to work towards addressing that problem. So I would say you need to think about how health inequalities affects your work, affects your patients, and also think about how the way that people have been treated in the past affects the way that they interact with healthcare now. And a recent example of that is the COVID vaccine uptake. We've had excellent uptake of the COVID vaccine in the UK, really good coverage. But if you break that down by ethnicity, then Black people are still the group of people who have the lowest uptake. And I think that stems from a lot of mistrust of healthcare, which comes from some of the experimentation and unethical practices of the past that are a legacy that affect how people interact with healthcare and how much they trust healthcare and trust doctors now.
Yeah, thank you, Esther. Great answer. Thank you. I wasn't aware of those statistics with respect to maternal deaths. So what lessons do you think we can take forward from Henrietta's story when training future generations of medics and particularly perhaps pathologists?
I think part of it is just, thinking differently and challenge what you see, question what you see. If you are a pathologist doing research in a laboratory, think about where your cells are coming from. Think about how these things have kind of come about. And take it into account. I'm really pleased to see that the college is building health inequalities into the curricula through Henrietta Davis, who's the Royal College of Pathologists Vice President for Learning. And I think that's really important to help our future trainees. But it may well be our trainees that are challenging their trainers, and we all need to think about this. Another thing that the college is doing in October is putting on a webinar about health inequalities in celebration of Black History Month. And so I would recommend that when it comes available to book.
Great, thank you. So Jeri and David, one of the most powerful parts of the book was when Dr. Christoph Lengauer asked Henrietta's children, Deborah, the oldest child, and Zachariah, the youngest, to visit him at Johns Hopkins University Hospital. And when he gave them a framed picture of the vari-colored HeLa cells, it was perhaps the first attempt to create a healing bridge, perhaps between the scientists and the Lacks family. What is the relationship now between the Lacks family and Johns Hopkins? Do you organize anything together?
I'm on me. We still work well. I mean, I guess you have different family members have different relationships with John Hopkins. Some of us work, I'm not gonna say closely, we work with them in tangent for like the HeLa, they do a HeLa Henrietta Lacks symposium once a year, and then a high school one day where they bring all the high school students in, and like they did us, take them around, let them see the cells, they give them a lab coat and everything else, and expose people in the inner city to HeLa cells, and it's been quite successful, and the kids just love it because, like I said, that's the first time they see John Hopkins as a research place. Yep. Most people told me that they see John Hopkins as mainly a hospital, and of course they got the old rumors from back in the day that John Hopkins would do experiment on people. So this opens their eyes up to it when they take them around. So we participate in high school day and this HeLa symposium, and they're currently working on building a building, and they're going to name it. I believe Jeri could elaborate on maybe Henrietta Lacks Hall or something like that. I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. But
yep. That's it, the Henrietta Lacks Hall.
Okay, but yeah, like I said, various degree, but we work with them. We have a cordial relationship with them. Like I said, anything we can do to help spread the word about Henrietta Lacks and her remarkable cells and what they've done to help mankind.
Great, thanks, David. So I saw actually on the Lacks Foundation website that the NIH and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute recently gave significant donations to the Lacks Foundation, perhaps as what they called a historical restitution for their use of the HeLa cells and their distribution without knowledge and obviously with financial aid. Do you consider this, Jeri, perhaps to be another attempt to create a healing bridge, and have there been other examples?
I would think so. It's another, like you say, another healing bridge with pharmaceuticals, biotech companies, and it was their way of, I guess, reparation towards the Lacks families, not directly, but it's indirectly when they gave to the Henrietta Lacks Foundation, and it was more so of addressing racial injustice in science. So that was their way of, if they saying every time they use the HeLa cells, they wanted to make sure that they give back to Henrietta Lacks family. So I think it was another way of kind of bridging that gap.
Right, that's great. Thank you.
And I just wanted to mention real quick, because we was just talking about, bridging the gap between the Lacks family and science when we did the NIH, and how the NIH partnered with the Lacks family, or the Lacks family partnered with NIH when they did the HeLa genome, and how they addressed the issue in publishing Henrietta's genome without contacting the family and getting our consent. And I don't know if y'all know, but they had posted Henrietta's entire genome publicly without our consent and without our knowledge, even though we knew it was, not illegal, but we thought it was something unethical, being as though, what the family has gone through so far with Henrietta's information being out there, or the family not giving consent to certain things. And it was, that partnership that we formed with the NIH to make sure that we can still move forward in science with using the HeLa genome, as well as protecting our privacy.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I mean, just a simple ask out of politeness would have been the most minimal thing they could have done. But anyway, I guess if you built bridges again with him, that's great. So before we go to the Q&A session, I'm just going to ask each of you very briefly, in one or two words, what you would take away from this book. So I'm going to go left to right, and on my left is Esther.
Justice and health takes conscious thought.
Great. Hephzi?
I'd say it's easily done. So as researchers, we should be a bit more cautious when we get we're excited about your discoveries, to not forget the ethics around, doing the right thing.
Super. Mark?
When we're designing research projects, ethics should be built in at the beginning rather than bolted on at the end, which seems to happen quite often.
Definitely. Jeri? And
I would say hope and healing.
that's great. That's lovely. And David?
To know Henrietta Lacks as a person, not just a cell, and just know the remarkable contributions she had did for the world.
That's terrific. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to go to the audience, and we're going to take questions. So I've got the first question from the audience, and this is, let me just see. How has Henrietta's story impacted the family and their community's trust of the medical profession, especially with an extensive history of mistrust and as a result of the lack of consent and transparency surrounding Henrietta's biopsy specimen? How can this lack of trust be improved? So I guess this is to you both, Jeri and David.
Well, I guess when we first learned about the story, we was already like teenagers, so we didn't have that. We didn't know the history of Henrietta Lacks, so we didn't have that, maybe say, mistrust of the medical system. So, like, me and Jeri go to the doctors on our normal basis or whatever, and I was John Hopkins, Bayview, or whatever. But as far as the improved relationships, I always say the best way to improve it is just communicate with people. Communicate and educate. If you communicate with them and also educate them, if even in the basic form, if somebody knows something a little bit more or understand it, they have a tendency to trust it a little bit better, as opposed to having somebody tell them what to say, tell them what to do, or tell them what to say. If they have an understanding of it, I find it'd be more trusting. So I would say communicate and educate.
And Jeri, do you want to add anything to that? Okay, that's great. Okay. So let me just see what other questions are here. So question number 2 from Heidi Gardner and Alexander Roche. So they write, I know it was a question raised in the book, but wondering where we are with this now. I'd be interested to hear the panel's view on payment and reimbursement for use of Henrietta's cells and other patients for the use of their cells, particularly from companies that are making money from products that have resulted from research using HeLa cells. Perhaps consent by the patient was originally given for research, but then the cells become directly implicated in manufacturing vaccines and medications and sold by pharma companies. Should the original patient family be remunerated for this? Who would like to take that? Hephzi, perhaps? Oh, sorry. And then Mark. or the other way around?
Under the Human Tissue Act in Britain, it's actually unlawful to sell tissue in any way. And so it would be difficult to offer reimbursement up front. And once you start trying to do it down the line, it's finding that balance of the intellectual input from the scientists who make the discoveries against the people who provided the tissue. We all have altruism coded into our genomes. And if we go back to the human tissue retention and the Bristol Hearts problems in Britain, nobody ever said they wanted to be paid. They just said, we wish somebody had asked us. So I think it's not about payment, it's about proper, fully informed consent.
Hephzi, do you just want to perhaps contribute to that, just considering that you perhaps worked with pharmaceutical companies?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's like when I said my last statement, that is easily done. And I'm glad Mike chipped in first because he's coming from the ethics point of view. But really, it is easily done. You know, you come across discovery, doing your research, and you pass a bit of it to your, colleague on the next bench. So I suppose what they could do is donate to the foundation, as NIH have done, as opposed to, giving payment up front for the results, because ultimately, as researchers, we're there for the greater good of mankind in the health sector. So it's a bit tricky.
Yeah. Tricky one. Okay, so here's a question 3. I wonder what practices in research today might future generations decide were unethical. So things that we're doing today, which future generations may think that are unethical. And what do you think needs to be done to stop unethical research practice? Is the current ethical review process sufficient? Mark, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think I've touched on it. I think research hosting institutions have to make Helsinki work. And I think that's the big thing, which basically means they have to police researchers that they do follow all the rules. And it's interesting that Hephzi says, oh, you pass them on to your colleague on the next bench. I don't think that's acceptable. I mean, when we released tissue from our biorepository, it was very clear. You couldn't pass it on to somebody else. You had to come back to us and we would review the project you wanted to do by an independent ethics committee. And so I think we've just got to take Helsinki seriously.
Okay, that's great. So I'm just going to read some comments. There are some comments in the chat box. So a huge thank you to everyone involved today, particularly Henrietta's family. A real honor. As a manager of a biorepository, consent and ethics is the forefront of our work each and every day. Thank you very much for such an informative discussion. And then there was another comment higher up. It's always a privilege to use patient-derived cells in research, but only with explicit permission of the patient donor. And then another, I applaud the family for their contribution. Thanks very much for the open discussion. So we do have a question from Adam, who's 14 years old. And he writes, could some of the genes in the HeLa cells be used for immortality? Given that, from my knowledge, cells eventually commit suicide, inverted commas, and given that the HeLa cells now seem to have bypassed that, is there some way that the HeLa cells and the genetic differences may enable us to become immortal? So Jeri or David, would you like to take that?
Well,
age 14.
I guess the immortal cells is also the cancer cells, so I don't know if it'll quite work that way. But I don't know. Do anybody who wants to live forever? I mean, that would be. I'm not sure, Jeri.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question, though. That's definitely a good question, but I'm not sure how to answer that one.
It's a very good question from Adam. Yes, immortality. Can we ever achieve it? Mm-hmm. There's another question here that's just popped into the box. is there still an issue, particularly with respect to drug company research in terms of collecting blood for DNA and but not being approached to use again in the future? Should the patient family always be asked before using DNA, whatever the source of that is, i.e. whether it's blood, tissue or tissue? So I don't know, Esther, would you like to take that? You've been relatively quiet.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've been involved in research recently around learning more about COVID, and we've been incredibly grateful to families who have agreed to allow their loved one who's recently died to undergo an autopsy so that we can study the tissues and have a look at how COVID is affecting those tissues. And I guess part of the process that we go through in order to be able to do that is a discussion with the family to obtain informed consent, to talk through the process, talk through why we want to do it, talk through what we're hoping to learn. But as part of that, the families give their consent for the tissue to be used in research that has ethical approval. So at the time, whilst I knew that we were doing this for one particular research study, but actually those tissue samples have been used for multiple different research studies into COVID because the family gave that consent. And at the time, we didn't know exactly which studies were going to happen, but the family give that sort of broad consent that they allow the tissues to be used wherever there is ethical approval. And I think that's the important thing. So it's not necessarily knowing every single time which study this tissue or cells are going to be used for, but has it gone through the right rigorous process of ethical approval to ensure that the cells or the tissue is being used appropriately.
Thank you very much, Esther. So this is probably the last question, I'm afraid. There are still more questions in the Q&A box, but I'm just considering the time. If scientists are not appropriate to make ethical decisions, then who is appropriate? Mark, would you like to answer that one?
In the NHS ethics system, a committee has to have 50% of its members as lay members, and that is the right balance. The scientists can understand the science, the lay people bring a vast amount of knowledge and experience from outside. So it's not if not scientists, the scientists have to work with the lay people, because it's very easy as a scientist to become focused on the potential outcome of the research rather than the impact on the individuals, as we see from what Chester Southam and the Baltimore Lead study did. So I think lay people and scientists together.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So just a last comment from Louisa Motta. I would like to thank the Lacks family. This book helped me to understand issues about consent that were not so apparent to me beforehand. These are issues about pharma and financial gain by third parties that deserve further consideration. This book also showed differences on how people from racial minorities were and are being treated. And then the last comment is that Henrietta Lacks' case has been a focus of ethics courses at Rutgers University and the University of Duisburg for the past decade. Thank you for this book club, and they very much appreciate the book in their ethics courses. So I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We all hope that you've enjoyed tonight's book club, and we'd very much, first of all, like to hear your thoughts. The RCPath team, engagement team, Tatcha and Penny, who've been very busy in the background, they would asking you to fill in this short feedback survey, and thereby you have a chance to win a £20 national book token. And also, I'd just like to say that that this club was recorded and would be available on the RCPath website, which you can see here, and also the previous books, which I mentioned before, so the Pandemic Century, Gulp, and 9 Pints. We, Tatcha and Penny, have a number of book clubs planned, So keep your eyes peeled for these. Essentially, all that's left is for me to say a huge thank you to Jeri and David for your time and for your dedication to Henrietta and to your grandmother's legacy. It's really amazing. And also to thank our amazing other panelists, Mark, Hephzi, and Esther, for your time. And also to Tadja and Penny. That wasn't in the script, but I'd like to thank you both very much for coordinating all of this. And with that, then I'd like to thank you all very much for attending, all approximately 380 of you. That's amazing. And I'd like to wish you a lovely evening and stay safe.
Okay, can I make one comment real quick before I know time is up? But I just wanted to make one comment. This is very important because it's in your country.
Go ahead.
It's a young lady by the name of Helen Wilson Rowe, who's a Black artist, okay, who will actually has been commissioned by the University of Bristol to actually create a statue of Henrietta Lacks. And it will be, I think it's in October of this year. I don't have all the information, but it will be up on our website.
Super. No, I
just wanted to mention that.
Okay. I met Helen when she was here in Liverpool, and she has also done a number of portraits of the Lacks family, and they're amazing. So thank you for mentioning her. She's wonderful.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much again, and have a lovely evening.
Okay, thank you.
Good night.
All right.
Good night all.
Good night.
Bye.